Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine, the Gluten Free RN. For this episode, I'm actually recording in Thailand. So if you hear some music in the background, I'm in my hotel room in Chiang Mai recording this episode. Stay tuned. We're going to do a recap of some of the important points from the International Celiac Disease Symposium 2017 held in New Delhi, India. Hello and welcome back to the Gluten Free RN podcast. I'm Nadine, recording today in Chiang Mai, Thailand. And welcome back to all of you who have been listening right along all over the world to the information that I'm bringing you about gluten intolerance and celiac disease, also known as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Believe it or not, there's still some very interesting dialogue that's occurring even within the celiac community about gluten sensitivity, non-celiac gluten sensitivity, and all of the nomenclature that goes along with what we talk about. And if you think the celiac specialists know exactly what they're talking about, please stay tuned because I can assure you that I've been following everything very closely for the last 11 years. And for as much as things have changed, and I would say very, very, very slowly, the more things stay the same. Interestingly enough, some of the conversations that were being held 11 years ago are still being held today in the conferences and between the celiac specialists themselves. And it's very important that people actually have the correct information. So I'm going to do my best today to give you some of the highlights. And this is going to be one of those episodes that I can't include everything. So we're going to revisit this topic, the International Celiac Disease Symposium, probably maybe 4, 5, or 6 times, because there was some new information and information that really does need to be reviewed and assessed and talked about. And let me just begin by saying it is very difficult to eat in India on a gluten-free diet. The conference itself did not provide entirely gluten-free food. I have been to conferences in the past where the entire conference provided entirely gluten-free food, so we really didn't have to worry, supposedly. And that is a caveat because there have been events at conferences where people have gotten gluten. But this conference, I did take my NEMA sensor, and I thought long and hard about taking my Easy Gluten test strips or the NEMA sensor for gluten, and I opted to take the NEMA sensor this time. And quite frankly, I'm very glad I did, because I did find several meals, both at the conference, actually the very last lunch that they served at the International Celiac Disease Conference, I did find gluten in my food, so I didn't eat it. I also had the pleasure of meeting several people at the conference that we follow each other on social media. So this is a huge shout out to Harpreet and Kara from Australia and a number of other people that I met at the International Celiac Disease Symposium, which is one of the benefits of actually attending an event like this, is that I get to meet up with old friends and meet new people that I would never have met if it weren't for social media such as Instagram and Facebook, LinkedIn, and I think that's all I'm on right now. If you have any questions or concerns or any issues that you want to talk to me about, either on the International Celiac Disease Symposium or any other topic, you can always reach me at my email address, which is nadine@glutenfreern.com. You can also message me through Facebook, which many people do all over the world, and there's even messaging on Instagram. If you have a question or concern, just give me a jingle one way or another. So let's get back to the International Celiac Disease Symposium. Of course, I was very excited to plan this trip. It was quite the undertaking, given that I didn't just go to India I also am including a trip to Thailand. So I started off in Bangkok. I'm currently in Chiang Mai, where I visited an elephant sanctuary, and I love elephants. So the elephant sanctuary was a extreme high point of this trip. And then tomorrow I leave and go to Phuket for a few days. And after the Phuket, I fly home to Oregon. This has been an amazing trip, and I highly encourage people to travel, even if they do have celiac disease. And I did talk about traveling on an earlier episode. Make sure you have as much information as humanly possible and also travel with some backup food, because even on airplanes or other places, while you're traveling, it's always good to have a stash of safe food to eat, given that it is somewhat tricky, especially in places like Thailand, where most people only speak Thai, to communicate what your dietary needs are. Or, of course, you can always carry the cards in the language of the country that you're visiting in order to communicate effectively what your dietary needs are. Now, getting back to the International Celiac Disease Symposium. I did, in fact, attend the very first day workshop, which was extra, put on by Dr. Abul Abbas from the University of California in San Francisco. He did an entire day conference on the immunological system, so your immune system. And he did a great job. I really enjoyed talking with him afterwards and very much enjoyed listening to him the entire first day. We talked a lot about T helper cells and killer cells and regulatory T cells. And we also talked about the thymus gland, which made me really interested in learning a lot more about the thymus gland because it is extremely important. Many of your T cells are actually manufactured in the thymus gland, which is connected in the area of your heart. So I want to do a little bit more research on the thymus gland, and I will bring that information to you because it is very important to your immune system. But that was a topic that was actually brought up at the Celiac Disease Symposium, at least on the first day, related to the immune system, which of course we all know celiac disease is considered to be an autoimmune issue. One of the interesting things that Dr. Abul Abbas actually said is that we are drowning in data, but thirsting for information. And I thought that was very timely because, yes, there is a lot of data that many scientists collect, and that data is everywhere. And I know I have a hard time keeping up with the current data and even all of the information. But really what we want is to boil all that data down and get the best information that we can out of all of that data that's collected. He also said, interestingly enough, that the mouse model is invaluable to immunology, but a mouse is a terrible model for disease, especially human disease, and especially for celiac disease. Now, Dr. Bana Jabri was there presenting, and she works from the University of Chicago, primarily with mouse models. And I found it somewhat interesting and fascinating that Dr. Abul Abbas actually mentioned the mouse model and that it doesn't work particularly well for celiac disease in particular. He also mentioned that it is very difficult to you can't do in vivo experiments in people because you can change different variables and whatnot, but people generally don't want to give up their lymph nodes for study, which is probably very true. I know I don't want to give up my lymph nodes if I can help it. He also went over the general immune system, which are the epithelial barriers, which we talk a lot about because the epithelial barriers are the ones in your intestines, in your colon, in your throat, in your skin, lungs, your blood-brain barrier. So those epithelial barriers are very important. And if you think about epithelial barriers, when we talk about leaky gut, epithelial barriers themselves become leaky. But they also produce local antibiotics or local antibodies. But it is primarily a mechanical barrier. There's also sentinels or guards known as dendritic cells, also very difficult to study because those are inside the tissues. There's phagocytes and macrophages and neutrophils, specialized lymphocytes that increase production during inflammatory reactions, including celiac disease, innate lymphoid cells. And the interesting thing is that our immune system actually recognizes double-stranded RNA, such as influenza and other viruses, which are double-stranded RNAs. And humans have single-stranded RNA, which means that we should not necessarily be attacking our own cells or recognizing our own cells as invaders or bad tissue. But those double-stranded RNA viruses should not be or can't escape the innate immune response. In some way, there is some immune response from the innate immune system. He talked about the mitochondria, which produces ATP. And we all know about mitochondria due to Dr. Terry Wall's work. And unfortunately, Dr. Terry Walls was not at the International Celiac Disease Symposium. But if you are interested in the mitochondria, you really can look up Dr. Terry Wall's work. And she is, of course, the neurologist that had MS or multiple sclerosis and cured herself with essentially a paleo diet, rebuilding and repairing her mitochondria. Dr. Abul Abbas spent the entire day reviewing the innate and adaptive immune system and responses in our body to viruses, to invaders, and to anything else that our body needs to protect itself against. So our immune system, of course, is very important in protecting our bodies. And when things like gluten are recognized as a toxin or an invader or something very bad for our body, our immune system will be kicked in. I've included the outline that we were sent from the ICDS 2017 India conference. And so if you want to follow along a little bit with that outline, you can do so. And if you have, again, any specific questions about any of the speakers, please let me know. I was unable to attend every talk, but I did take notes on many of the speakers while I was there. There was both a scientific forum and a clinical forum. I chose to listen to many of the speakers in the clinical forum, mostly because the information that they were presenting was more applicable to my practice and how I can best give you information that will help you. Right now, I want to talk a little bit about the official first day of the conference. And Dr. Alessio Fasano was the first speaker in the clinical forum entitled The Spectrum of Gluten-Related Disorders. And Dr. Fasano, as you all know, is currently at Harvard University. And he said some really interesting things, as he always does, that there continues to be a controversy on who should be on a gluten-free diet. Is it only with people with CD or celiac disease, or is it everyone? By the end of 2017, celiac disease will be a $17.6 billion business. Remember I said that this is the largest untapped market in the world and that I'm not kidding about that? Well, it keeps going up exponentially almost every year. So celiac disease is big business. And that's one of the reasons I'm very concerned about the information that is not getting out to the public, that people are not getting the correct information. So that's one of the reasons we do this podcast, is to make sure that you get the best information possible so that you can get better faster and more completely. Because sometimes the ramifications of not being on a gluten-free or a whole food or some form of a paleo diet can be pretty harsh. And we do know that gluten cannot be digested by the human body, can't be broken down. It's still a long-chain amino acid. And that long-chain amino acid, which is 33 mer long, triggers an autoimmune response, especially in people that are HLA, DQ2, and or DQ8 positive. Please keep in mind that there is a greater and greater segment of the population that is not an HLA, DQ2, and or DQ8 gene carrier, but those people are still presenting with positive antibodies and villus atrophy. And also, people that are AGA positive, which is the anti-gliadin antibody, are just as much at risk for developing neurological issues associated with consuming gluten. And we'll go over that much more in depth when I talk about Dr. Marios Hadjivasiliou's presentation, who I still adore enormously. He's my favorite expert on the neurological component of celiac disease. Dr. Fasano actually made a point that gluten affects every single tissue of your body, even the brain, and that celiac disease has been found to double every 15 years in the United States. And I believe if people are consuming gluten in every country or any country that is consuming gluten, that you will find the same statistics. Interestingly enough, 1 out of every 2 people in the United States will try a gluten-free diet this year. Is it a medical necessity? Well, that's still debated in the community, in the celiac community. But Dr. Fasano at this point has said that for people that go on a gluten-free diet, fine, that's their choice. They don't get so angry about it anymore, which is good. If people choose to go on a gluten-free diet, while they may not be supportive, they actually recognize that, hey, that's their choice. They can eat however they actually choose. And what I heard over and over and over in this conference is that we used to think, we don't know, we're unsure, more studies need to be planned and implemented. There's a lot of work to be done. We thought we knew this, but we were wrong. And also that none of what we thought in the past was true. So that's what I meant by saying, well, a lot of time has passed, and I've been following this very closely for the last 11 years and very deeply entrenched that not a lot has changed. And mostly what we've learned has been, I want to say, to the negative, that the scientists have mostly found that what their theories were about celiac disease were wrong. So now they're going to either have to redo some of those studies or come up with new studies. And of course, I have many studies I would like done. So if anybody has any money or a chance to do a really good study that is designed extremely well, contact me and I'll happily share some of those ideas for studies that really do need to be done. Dr. Fasano also stated that many of those studies that were done on infant feeding and breastfeeding and the incidence of celiac disease or the onset of celiac disease, none of that has anything to do with celiac disease. If an infant is being fed gluten, either through breast milk or through the feeding practices, even formulas, then those babies are at increased risk for developing celiac disease. It doesn't matter when you start feeding them gluten. It doesn't matter how much. It just matters that they're getting exposed to gluten. So if you have an opportunity to prevent your baby from ever getting gluten, and that includes in utero and through breast milk, please prevent your baby from getting gluten, because interestingly enough, they'll never develop celiac disease because that is the factor that triggers those genes, the DQ2 and or DQ8. So I've said it before, and the babies that are actually cooked in utero, and I say that as a nurse, they're actually developed in utero without gluten because the mom's not eating gluten and hopefully dairy, and the baby is not exposed to gluten during the prime developmental times, the first 3 years especially, then those babies are extra shiny and sparkly, meaning they're extremely well physically developed, they're emotionally stable, and very peaceful, sweet babies. They grow appropriately, they develop appropriately, and those kids are extra shiny and sparkly. So I cannot stress enough that if you're going to get pregnant or if you are considering having a child, or even if you already have a baby, there's no downside to not giving your baby gluten. There are dangers and there are risks to actually feeding your baby gluten, especially if you and or your child is HLA-DQ2 and or DQ8 positive. The interesting thing about this conference, mentioned many, many, many times, is that it's not 1% of the population. Depending on where you are in the world, the prevalence is increasing. Right now, the prevalence in the United States is 3%. It's not 1%, it's 3%. So yes, interestingly enough, the prevalence of celiac disease in the United States is 3%. That's much higher than the 1% that has consistently been reported. That's millions and millions of more people. One of the primary reasons I wanted to go to this conference was because it's held in India. They used to tell people of Asian descent that they would never get celiac disease. Well, that's been proven wrong over and over and over and over again. Again, wherever we look for celiac disease, we find it. It doesn't matter your ethnicity. It doesn't necessarily matter where you are in the world. If you're an HLA-DQ2 and or DQ8 gene carrier, which it has been shown over and over and over again that at least 30 to 50% of the population, that's the world population, are gene carriers for those two genes, and you're eating gluten, then you're at risk for developing celiac disease. Additionally, if you're eating gluten, but you're not a gene carrier, there's still a risk that you are being damaged by gluten. We currently call that is non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And I'll mention this here. It has been found that it doesn't matter if you're HLA-DQ2 or DQ8 gene carrier and have celiac disease, or if you've been determined to have non-celiac gluten sensitivity with a positive AGA, the anti-gliadin antibody test, there's still a huge risk of developing neurological disorders. And those groups are equal. So there's a number of neurological issues that are affecting people in the Asian population, and that's India, Japan, Russia, Burma, everywhere in Asia. It doesn't really matter. If you are of Asian descent from any country in Asia, then you are at increased risk for celiac disease. It's currently estimated that the global prevalence of celiac disease is 1.37%. Each continent is different, and I suspect that has to do with different testing and different setup for the prevalence studies, different criteria, and different factors. In Eastern and Southern Asia, it is estimated that approximately 6 to 8 million people have celiac disease. In the Asian countries, which are about 50 countries, 60% of the world's population, which is 4.2 billion. In China, that would make 1.35 billion. In India, 1.22 billion people with celiac disease. And again, they used to tell people in China that they wouldn't have celiac disease or they couldn't develop celiac disease. Interestingly enough, a recent study found that 2.19% were positive for celiac disease in China in a group of 16 to 25-year-olds. Now, take into account that older Chinese people probably didn't have a lot of wheat in their diet. But certainly, this generation and the preceding generation have been exposed to gluten in huge quantities, especially considering that they never used to be exposed to gluten. So they're genetically predisposed, and currently in the culture, it's very common to see fast food joints, and very few products actually don't have any gluten in them. If you ask people of Asian descent, they will say, trust me, I've been asking these questions all for the last 2 weeks here in Asia. Do you eat a lot of wheat? And over and over and over again, people will say, no, we're primarily a rice-based diet. But if you actually look at many of the products on the shelves, there is wheat in some form in many products. That includes soy sauce, which Thai people think that they don't eat a lot of soy sauce, but they do. There's soy sauce, which the number 1 or number 2 ingredient is going to be wheat. I even picked up a package of cashews and walnuts and a few different things. The number 1 ingredient is cashews. The number 2 ingredient is wheat flour. Tell me why that's necessary, because I can't figure that out. We went through many products in the grocery stores in both India and Thailand, and the vast majority of the products either contain wheat as a primary ingredient, or those products are processed in a facility that also processes wheat. So the risk of cross-contamination is enormous. As far as Dr. Fasano is concerned, Russia is still unexplored as far as celiac disease, but there are more and more studies coming out of Russia. Again, Russia is in Asia, so we need to include them in a global study, but we certainly know that wheat production has increased globally, even though the price for wheat has gone down because less people are eating it. We're finding new markets for it, by the way. I'm not. So Asia is now the center stage of celiac disease per Dr. Fasano. I would like to take that back and put that center stage wherever it is that you live, wherever it is that you practice as a practitioner, so that you can begin doing these mass studies on the prevalence of celiac disease wherever you are. Of course, it was noted, and if you follow me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, you'll know that I did tweet that all patients with anemia have to be tested for celiac disease. All patients with osteoporosis need to be tested for celiac disease. All patients with any liver enzymes that are slightly elevated or out of range need to be tested for celiac disease. There's many other diagnoses that need to be tested for celiac disease. Anybody with an eating disorder or anorexia needs to be tested for celiac disease. And there were many, many other very specific case studies and poster presentations that dealt with very specific diseases. Of course, we all know that anyone with type 1 diabetes, anyone with autoimmune thyroiditis, needs to be tested for celiac disease. Any other autoimmune disease needs to be tested for celiac disease, and not just once. They need to be tested for celiac disease every year if they don't meet the criteria at that point in history, because they can seroconvert at any time, and especially the people with HLA-DQ2 and or DQ8 can never be ruled out for celiac disease. They can develop it at any age, with any symptom or no symptom. So it's very important to keep an eye on people. I'm going to mention Wilson's disease because this had come up in conversation in the recent past, that 3% of the people with Wilson's disease were actually found to have celiac disease. I will look up that study, and I will also make a presentation on Wilson's disease specifically at some point in the future. No promises on when that's going to happen, but it will happen in the future. So that was a very long-winded, quick podcast on basically the first day and a little bit of the International Celiac Disease Symposium. So there's a lot of information to review, so you can see why one podcast on the International Celiac Disease Symposium is not going to do it justice. They all agreed on, all the celiac disease experts around the world agreed on, is that there's poor support, poor knowledge, poor understanding, poor food choices, and that we really need to work on increasing the knowledge base of the general practitioners, work on peer mentorships, increasing the public education, educating food manufacturers, finding out where gluten hides or where it is in food and personal care products, and then take the education to non-traditional meeting groups in settings such as churches, schools, clinics, parks and recreations, sporting events and teams, that we really need to educate the population about celiac disease, not just very specific doctors, nurses, and dietitians and registered dietitians, that we need to make sure that everybody is globally educated about celiac disease, because this is a global issue and we need to take it and finally deal with it. And I honestly don't want to wait another 10 years for all of this information to get disseminated to the population. I want people to be extremely well educated about what gluten is, where it hides, what it can do to you, how to avoid it, and then how to get yourself healthy again, how to undo some of the damage that's been done and prevent any further damage from gluten. Because not only is it a toxin to our body, it is also a neurotoxin. So it's very important that we recognize that and act accordingly. this wraps up episode 42, where we first start recapping the International Celiac Disease Symposium that was held in New Delhi, India this year, just in September 2017. And this is the first of a few episodes of the Gluten Free RN podcast that we're going to talk about this. If you haven't looked up my Instagram or Facebook page or Twitter, do it now, and then you can see some of the pictures that I posted, both of the food and some of my adventures in India and Thailand. The people that have been commenting on the pictures and the comments actually are getting a lot of information, and it's just another way to follow the Gluten Free RN. And that's me, Nadine Groskowiak, the Gluten Free RN, and this is the Gluten Free RN podcast, episode 42. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's really good for me to recap all of the information that came out of the International Celiac Disease Symposium and bring it to you. Remember, if you think celiac disease doesn't affect you, your family, and your friends, think again. Until next time, I'm Nadine Groskowiak, signing out. Bye.